Kate had always been the kind of woman who poured her heart and soul into everything she did. A brilliant microbiologist, she had dedicated the better part of her life to developing an innovative antibiotic that promised to revolutionize modern medicine. Yet, in the quiet corners of her mind, she knew the price of that success: long nights away from home, a growing distance between her and Brian, and the nagging guilt of missing her daughter's fleeting childhood moments. But life had a cruel way of tipping the scales. Losing their daughter was the kind of pain that didn't heal. It hollowed her out, left her questioning everything. In the wake of that tragedy, Kate made a monumental decision: she would leave the lab, the company she had built from the ground up, and the career that defined her. She handed over the reins to Brian, her husband, hoping that this gesture of trust and sacrifice would mend their fractured marriage. At first, Brian seemed to rise to the occasion. He dove into the role of managing the pharmaceutical company, expressing gratitude for Kate's belief in him. For a while, she convinced herself that this was the right choice. They could grieve together, rebuild together, and maybe, just maybe, find their way back to the love they once shared. But then came the signs. Small things, barely noticeable at first. Brian had always been charming, but his smiles grew more distant, his late nights more frequent. When Kate asked, he brushed it off, blaming the demands of running the company. "I'm doing this for us," he'd say, his tone exasperated yet somehow hollow. Kate wanted to believe him, desperately so, but her intuition whispered otherwise. Something felt off, like a crack running through the foundation of their lives, widening with each passing day. One evening, while tidying up his home office, she stumbled upon a receipt tucked under a stack of documents. It was for an expensive dinner at a restaurant she'd never been to. Her heart sank as she read the date. Brian had told her he was working late that night. Her stomach churned, a sickening cocktail of dread and denial. Surely, there was an explanation. Perhaps it was a business dinner? A client? Yet the pang of doubt refused to let go, tightening its grip around her chest. The first crack had appeared. Little did Kate know, it was only the beginning. Kate couldn't let it go. The receipt felt like a breadcrumb leading to something she wasn't ready to face but couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, her mind raced, trying to rationalize the discovery while simultaneously piecing together every suspicious detail from the past few months. The late-night meetings, the sudden interest in his appearance, and his increasingly guarded demeanor, none of it added up. One sleepless night, unable to silence her doubts, Kate picked up Brian's phone. He always left it charging on his nightstand, trusting her implicitly, or perhaps, underestimating her curiosity. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it, knowing that this single act might shatter whatever fragile illusion of trust remained between them. At first, there was nothing, no incriminating messages, no suggestive photos. Relief began to wash over her, only to be yanked away as she opened his email. Buried in the folder labeled "Personal" were flight confirmations for 2 passengers, Brian and Laura. They were set to leave for the Maldives in 3 weeks. Her chest tightened, and her vision blurred as she scrolled through the messages. Laura. The name was all too familiar. She was his assistant, young, ambitious, and impossibly beautiful. Kate had met her a handful of times, always brushing off her polished charm as nothing more than professional courtesy. The messages between Brian and Laura were explicit, unguarded in their intimacy. Lines like, "I can't wait to finally be free with you," and "This time together will be perfect," drove a dagger into her heart. The final blow came when she saw the subject line of an attachment, Kate's signature. It didn't take long to understand the betrayal. Brian wasn't just cheating, he was using Kate's trust and authority to forge documents that would funnel millions out of the company, likely ruining the business she had spent her life building. Her entire world felt like it was caving in. The next morning, Kate could barely look at Brian. The weight of her discovery churned inside her, threatening to spill over at any moment. She decided to confront him that evening, determined to uncover every ugly truth. When Brian walked through the door, she forced herself to stay calm. Busy day, she asked, her voice tight with forced nonchalance. He looked at her, startled by the question, then nodded. Yeah, the usual. A lot of meetings. You know how it is. Oh, I do, she replied, the sarcasm barely veiled. I imagine it must be exhausting, juggling work, planning a vacation, and, oh, right, screwing your assistant. Brian froze mid-step. The blood drained from his face, and for a moment, Kate thought he might deny it outright. But then his expression shifted, part shock, part irritation, and entirely unapologetic. I can explain, he said, his voice suddenly defensive. It's not what you think. Kate slammed the printed emails and flight confirmations onto the table. Not what I think. You've been lying to me, betraying me, using me to steal from the company I built. Tell me, Brian, what exactly am I misunderstanding here? He didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, Kate, I didn't mean for this to happen. Laura and I, it just happened. You've been so distant, so consumed by your grief, and I needed someone who was there for me. Her jaw dropped. Are you seriously blaming this on me? On grief? I left everything, my career, my passion, because I thought it would help us heal. And this is how you repay me? Brian didn't respond. Instead, his gaze hardened, and he said the words that would haunt her forever. Well, maybe if you'd been a better wife, this wouldn't have happened. Brian's words echoed in Kate's mind long after he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. Her anger, sharp and searing, began to unravel into a deeper, more hollow ache. How could he? After everything they had been through, everything she had sacrificed, how could he reduce her pain and their shared loss to a justification for his infidelity? Tears streamed down her face as she crumpled onto the floor. For hours, she sat there, reliving every moment of their marriage, searching for the signs she had missed. Had she been blind? Or had he always been this selfish, this calculating, and she had simply refused to see it? Kate spent the next few days in a haze of disbelief, replaying every detail of her confrontation with Brian. His words had cut deeper than any betrayal ever could. The man she had trusted with her heart, her dreams, her very future had reduced her pain, her love, to a simple inconvenience. Yet, his betrayal ran deeper than just his affair with Laura. He had exploited her grief, her vulnerability, and used it as a tool to orchestrate his selfish plans. But Brian wasn't done yet. His reaction to being caught wasn't remorse, it was strategy. The morning after their confrontation, he was disturbingly composed, acting as though the argument had never happened. He didn't apologize, didn't explain further. Instead, he carried on with his daily routine, leaving Kate to fester in her emotions, alone in the house that now felt like a cage. She considered leaving, packing her bags and walking away from the life they had built together, but a gnawing voice in the back of her mind held her back. This wasn't just about her marriage anymore, it was about the company she had built with her blood, sweat, and tears. She couldn't let Brian destroy it, couldn't let him walk away unscathed, not with Laura, not with her life's work. Kate tried to gather herself, but every time she thought she had regained control, Brian threw another curveball. One afternoon, she overheard him on the phone in his study. He spoke in hushed tones, but his words were unmistakable. She's starting to crack. I'll get her signature soon. Laura's finalizing the offshore accounts. Her heart raced as the implications hit her. Brian wasn't just planning to leave her, he was planning to strip her of everything she had left and disappear with Laura. Anger bubbled beneath her skin, but she forced herself to remain calm. She needed to think, to act strategically. If Brian was playing a game, she would have to play it better. Brian's strategy became clearer over the next few days. He was keeping her isolated, emotionally drained, and psychologically trapped. He cancelled the few social engagements they had left and even had the audacity to suggest she take it easy and focus on herself. At first, Kate thought it was an attempt at reconciliation, but she quickly realized it was a way to keep her out of the public eye. The mansion, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every room held memories of a life she thought she'd had, happy moments that now seemed like cruel illusions. Brian's presence was a constant reminder of her betrayal. He wasn't cruel in a blatant way, his manipulation was subtle, calculated. He played the role of the caring husband in front of the household staff, ensuring that no one suspected a thing. But the staff weren't blind. One evening, as Kate sat in the garden trying to clear her mind, the housekeeper, Maria, approached her. "Mrs. Donovan," Maria began hesitantly, "I don't mean to overstep, but, is everything all right?" Kate looked at her, startled by the question. Maria had been with them for years, a quiet but steady presence in the house. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, which made her concern all the more striking. "I'm fine, Maria," Kate lied, her voice trembling. Maria hesitated before placing a gentle hand on Kate's arm. "You don't seem fine. If you ever need anything, I'm here." It was a small gesture, but it ignited something inside Kate. She wasn't as alone as Brian wanted her to feel. Maybe she couldn't trust everyone, but she could find allies, people who could help her navigate the treacherous waters her life had become. Brian's mask began to slip as Kate refused to give him the signature he so desperately needed. She started to push back, asking questions about the documents he brought to her, delaying her decisions, and feigning confusion. "Why do you need my signature on this?" she asked one evening as he presented her with another stack of papers. "It's just procedural," he replied smoothly, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "The board needs it to approve the new investment." Kate raised an eyebrow. "Why does the board need my approval? You're the CEO now." His frustration flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it with a charming smile. "You know how these things are, Kate. Just sign it. It'll make everything easier." She stared at him, her heart pounding. This wasn't just about the company, this was about control. Brian wanted her out of the picture, and this signature was the final nail in the coffin. "I'll think about it," she said, standing and leaving the room before he could protest. Later that night, she heard him on the phone again, his voice angrier this time. "She's stalling. I don't know what she's trying to pull, but we need to move fast. I'll handle it." Kate's blood ran cold. It was clear now, Brian wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, and he was willing to destroy her to get it. She had to act before it was too late. Kate knew she couldn't confront Brian directly, he was too calculating, too dangerous. Instead, she decided to gather evidence, to build a case against him that would not only protect her company but also ensure he couldn't walk away unpunished. She began by reaching out to an old friend, Emily, a corporate lawyer she trusted implicitly. Over a secure call, Kate laid everything out, the affair, the forged documents, the offshore accounts. Emily was horrified but agreed to help. "You need to get access to those accounts," Emily said. "If we can prove he's embezzling, we can freeze his assets before he has a chance to disappear." It wasn't going to be easy, but Kate was determined. She would play Brian's game, but on her terms. She would let him think he was winning, all the while building the evidence she needed to bring him down. The first step was to gain access to his office, where she suspected he kept the financial records. She couldn't risk being caught, so she enlisted Maria's help. The housekeeper agreed to distract Brian while Kate searched his study. As she rifled through his drawers, her hands shaking, she found exactly what she was looking for, copies of the forged documents and a USB drive labeled LNK accounts. Her heart raced as she pocketed the drive and quickly left the room. Kate retreated to the privacy of her bedroom, clutching the USB drive as if it were her lifeline. She plugged it into her laptop, her fingers trembling as she navigated through the folders. Each click revealed a deeper layer of Brian's betrayal. There were spreadsheets showing offshore transfers, emails outlining his plans with Laura, and, most damning of all, a folder titled Exit Strategy. Inside were detailed plans to liquidate the company's assets, transfer funds to an untraceable account, and disappear. As she read through the files, her stomach churned. Brian wasn't just stealing from her, he was destroying the company's future, putting hundreds of employees at risk, and sabotaging a groundbreaking medical innovation that could save lives. And for what? A lavish escape with his mistress? Her emotions swung wildly between heartbreak and fury. She thought of all the nights she had stayed up, pouring her soul into the company, the sacrifices she had made, and the faith she had placed in Brian. Now, that faith felt like a cruel joke. Among the files, Kate found another unsettling discovery, a draft letter addressed to the board, claiming that Kate had willingly resigned due to mental instability. It was a preemptive strike, a way for Brian to discredit her should she try to fight back. Her vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to keep reading. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. Every detail she uncovered was another weapon in her arsenal, another step closer to exposing Brian for the liar and thief he was. The next morning, Kate acted as though nothing had changed. She greeted Brian with a cold but polite smile, suppressing the urge to lash out at him. If he suspected she knew the extent of his betrayal, he might accelerate his plans, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Brian, ever the charmer, seemed oblivious to her turmoil. He kissed her cheek, the gesture so hollow it made her skin crawl. "I'll be late tonight," he said casually. "Another investor meeting." Kate nodded, masking her contempt. "Of course. Let me know if you need anything." As soon as he left, she called Emily, who had been working tirelessly on their strategy. "I have the files," Kate said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "It's worse than we thought." Emily listened as Kate explained everything she had found. "We'll need to move quickly," Emily said. "I'll start drafting the necessary legal documents. In the meantime, you need to stay safe. Brian won't take this lightly if he finds out you're onto him." Kate nodded, though the weight of Emily's warning settled heavily on her shoulders. Brian wasn't just a cheater or a manipulator, he was dangerous. And now, she was playing a high-stakes game against him. That evening, Kate waited for Brian to return, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. When he walked through the door, his expression was tense. She could tell something had gone wrong. "What's the matter?" she asked, feigning concern. Brian waved her off. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Kate noticed the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the slight hesitation in his voice. He was starting to feel the pressure, and she knew she could use that to her advantage. Over dinner, she decided to test him. "You've been working so hard lately," she said, her tone light. "I was thinking we should take a trip, just the two of us. Maybe somewhere warm." Brian's fork paused mid-air. "A trip?" he echoed, clearly caught off guard. "Yes," she said, forcing a smile. "I think it would do us good. Don't you?" He hesitated, then forced a smile of his own. "That's a lovely idea. Let me wrap up a few things at work, and we'll plan something." Kate nodded, but her mind was racing. His response confirmed her suspicions. Brian was too deep into his scheme to abandon it now. The trip was a test, and he had failed. He was still planning to leave, still plotting his betrayal. Kate's anger burned hotter every time she thought about Laura. The emails she had found painted a vivid picture of their relationship, one filled with passion, greed, and mutual disdain for Kate. Laura wasn't just a passive participant in Brian's scheme, she was an active accomplice, pushing him to move faster and take bigger risks. In one particularly enraging email, Laura had written, "She's so pathetic. You're doing her a favor by ending it. Just make sure she signs those papers before she figures out what's happening." Kate clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she read and reread the message. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was an attack on her very identity, on everything she had worked so hard to build. But Kate wasn't the same woman Brian and Laura thought they could manipulate. She was done being a victim. It was time to take control. The next step in Kate's plan was risky, but necessary. With Emily's help, she contacted a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. Together, they began tracing the offshore accounts, looking for any connections that could tie Brian and Laura directly to their illegal activities. At the same time, Kate started subtly gathering support within the company. She reached out to trusted colleagues, carefully gauging their loyalty and planting seeds of doubt about Brian's leadership. If she was going to take him down, she needed allies. Meanwhile, Maria proved to be an invaluable asset. The housekeeper kept a close eye on Brian, reporting back to Kate whenever he had suspicious meetings or phone calls. It was through Maria that Kate learned about an upcoming dinner Brian had planned with Laura, a private celebration of their success. Kate's blood boiled at the thought, but she forced herself to stay focused. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Kate's hands shook as she reviewed her plan for the evening. Maria had slipped her the location of Brian and Laura's private dinner, a small, upscale restaurant nestled on the outskirts of town. It was perfect for discretion, the kind of place where secrets were shared over candlelight and expensive wine. But tonight, there would be no secrets. Not anymore. Kate dressed carefully, choosing a sleek black dress that hugged her frame. She wanted to look strong, composed, a stark contrast to the image of the grieving, naive wife Brian had painted her to be. Her hair was swept into a loose bun, and her makeup was understated but flawless. She slipped a small voice recorder into her clutch, ensuring she had every tool she needed for what was to come. As she drove to the restaurant, her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure how this would play out, but she knew one thing: Brian and Laura would leave tonight knowing they had underestimated her. When she arrived, she spotted them immediately. They were seated at a corner table, tucked away from prying eyes, but their body language screamed intimacy. Brian was leaning forward, his hand resting on Laura's, while she giggled and sipped from a glass of champagne. Kate's stomach churned, but she pushed the emotion aside. She had work to do. With deliberate steps, she approached their table. Brian's back was to her, but Laura spotted her first. Her eyes widened in shock, and the blood drained from her face. "Kate?" Brian's voice was incredulous as he turned around. What are you doing here?" Kate gave them a tight smile, her voice cold. "Oh, don't mind me. I just thought I'd join my husband and his mistress for dinner." The restaurant seemed to go silent, the quiet hum of conversation around them fading as patrons turned to watch the unfolding drama. Brian stood, his face a mixture of anger and panic. "Kate, this isn't what it looks like." She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Really?" "Because it looks exactly like what it is. You, cheating on me with your assistant. You, stealing from my company. You, planning to run away with her and leave me to pick up the pieces." Laura opened her mouth to speak, but Kate held up a hand. "Don't," she snapped. "You've done enough." The strength in her voice surprised even her, and for a moment, Brian looked genuinely afraid. He reached out to touch her arm, but she stepped back. "Save your excuses, Brian. I know everything. The offshore accounts, the forged documents, the exit strategy. You're not as clever as you think." Kate sat in her car outside the restaurant for what felt like hours, her mind racing as she pieced together the perfect confrontation. Every word she had read in Brian and Laura's emails, every sneer and insult Laura had made at her expense, and every ounce of betrayal Brian had inflicted burned in her chest. But she didn't want to enter that restaurant in a blind rage. No, this needed to be calculated, sharp, and unrelenting. Brian and Laura needed to feel the weight of what they had done, not just to her, but to the company and the future they had tried to destroy. She took a deep breath, adjusted her dress, and stepped out of the car. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the restaurant, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she scanned the dimly lit space and spotted them immediately. Laura's laugh floated through the air like nails on a chalkboard, and Brian leaned in, whispering something that made her giggle like a schoolgirl. Kate's vision blurred with rage, but she steadied herself. She wasn't here to scream or cry. She was here to dismantle them. "Brian," Kate said sharply as she reached their table, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter. Brian froze, his head snapping up. Laura's face paled, her glass of champagne trembling in her hand. Kate, Brian stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. What are you doing here?" Kate gave a small, icy smile and took the empty seat across from them. "Oh, don't mind me. I just thought I'd join my husband and his, what's the word, accomplice for dinner." Laura opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Kate set her clutch on the table, deliberately pulling out a voice recorder and placing it between them. "This," Kate said, her voice calm but laced with venom, "is a record of everything. Every lie, every scheme, every disgusting plan you've made to rob me of my company, my dignity, and my future. And the best part? It's only the beginning." Brian's face turned ashen. "Kate, let's not do this here," he said through gritted teeth, his charm faltering. "Oh, but why not?" Kate replied, leaning forward. "You didn't seem to mind plotting your little getaway here. It seems fitting that we settle things in the same place." Laura's mask of confidence cracked. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her voice shaking. "You're blowing everything out of proportion." Kate's laugh was cold and hollow. "Blowing it out of proportion? Let me be very clear, Laura. I have everything I need to bury you both. And I will. But first, I want to watch you squirm." As Kate walked out of the restaurant, her head held high, her heart pounded against her ribs. She had won the confrontation, but she knew the real battle was far from over. She slipped into her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady her breathing. Tonight had been a calculated blow, but it wasn't enough to stop Brian and Laura completely. She needed to take the next steps carefully, every move had to be deliberate, every piece of evidence perfectly placed. Back at home, the silence of the mansion was deafening. Kate poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the dimly lit living room, going over the events of the evening. Her mind lingered on the moment Laura's confidence crumbled, the way Brian's carefully curated charm dissolved into desperation. It was satisfying, yes, but it also revealed how dangerous they both were. Cornered animals always fought the hardest, and Kate had effectively trapped them both. She pulled out her laptop and began reviewing the financial documents again. Every number, every transaction had to be airtight before she handed them over to the authorities. Emily had warned her that Brian might try to shift the blame entirely onto Laura, painting her as the mastermind. It was a predictable move. Cowards like Brian never took responsibility for their actions. But Kate wasn't going to let him get away with it. The night stretched on as she worked, her focus unyielding. By the time the sun began to rise, she had compiled an exhaustive report of Brian's fraudulent activities. It wasn't just about protecting herself anymore. The company, the employees, and even the patients who depended on the life-saving antibiotic she had developed, they were all at risk because of Brian's greed. This fight was bigger than her personal betrayal, and that realization gave her strength. The morning after the dinner, Laura sat alone in her apartment, staring blankly at her phone. Brian hadn't called. Not once. She had expected him to have a plan, to reassure her that everything would be fine. Instead, she was met with silence. Her anxiety grew with every passing hour. Her thoughts drifted to Kate's words the night before. The woman had been ruthless, confident, and utterly terrifying. Laura had underestimated her, just as Brian had. And now, they were both paying the price. By mid-afternoon, Laura's desperation drove her to action. She needed to protect herself. If Brian wasn't going to step up, she would have to save her own skin. She began combing through her emails and files, pulling every piece of correspondence that could implicate Brian while minimizing her involvement. It was a delicate balancing act. She had to appear cooperative without painting herself as the architect of the scheme. When Laura finally walked into Emily's office that evening, her hands were trembling. She had debated this decision all day, but she knew it was her only chance. "I'm here to talk to Kate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily studied her carefully. "You'd better have something worthwhile to say." When Kate entered the conference room and saw Laura sitting there, she felt a surge of anger. This was the woman who had not only stolen her husband but had also tried to destroy everything she had worked for. It took every ounce of restraint for Kate to sit across from her without letting her fury show. "What do you want?" Kate asked coldly. Laura hesitated, wringing her hands. "I know you don't trust me," she began, her voice shaky. "And I don't blame you. But Brian's thrown me under the bus. He's trying to pin everything on me. I can't go down for this, Kate." Kate's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You're worried about yourself? How noble." Laura flinched but pressed on. "I have evidence, emails, financial records, things that prove Brian was the one orchestrating everything. If you help me, I'll help you." Kate leaned back in her chair, studying Laura with narrowed eyes. "And what exactly do you want in return?" "Protection," Laura said quickly. "I'll testify against Brian, but I don't want to be prosecuted." Emily, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "That's not entirely up to us. But if your evidence is as good as you say, we can negotiate with the authorities." Kate nodded slowly, her mind racing. She hated the idea of working with Laura, but the evidence she promised could be the final nail in Brian's coffin. "Fine," Kate said. "But understand this, if you're lying, or if you hold back anything, I'll make sure you regret it." While Kate and Laura were solidifying their alliance, Brian was spiraling. The freezing of the accounts had blindsided him, and his lawyers had been unable to get them unfrozen. Worse, word was spreading among the board members about his alleged misconduct. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but there were no solutions, only questions and demands. Brian spent the day pacing his office, his mind racing. He had always been able to charm his way out of tough situations, but this felt different. Kate had him cornered, and he knew it. His only hope was to shift the blame entirely onto Laura and hope the board and authorities bought his story. By the evening, his frustration boiled over. He called Laura, his voice dripping with anger. "What the hell did you tell Kate?" he demanded. Laura's response was cold. "I told her the truth, Brian. You wanted to leave me hanging out to dry. Well, guess what, I'm not going down alone." Brian's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles white. "You ungrateful." "Don't bother," Laura interrupted. "You're finished, Brian. Kate's got everything, and now so do the authorities." Brian slammed the phone down, his chest heaving. For the first time, he realized he had truly lost. The arrest came 2 days later. Kate watched from the safety of her car as officers swarmed the mansion, Brian shouting protests as he was led away in handcuffs. It was a surreal moment, both triumphant and heartbreaking. This was the man she had once loved, the father of her child, and yet, he had betrayed her in the cruelest ways imaginable. As Brian disappeared into the police car, Kate felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't joy or relief, but a quiet acceptance. She had fought back and won. Now, it was time to rebuild. Over the next few months, Kate threw herself into her work. The company needed her leadership more than ever, and she was determined to restore its reputation. She also took time to focus on herself, reconnecting with friends and rediscovering the parts of her life she had neglected during her marriage. The scars of Brian's betrayal would never fully fade, but they became a source of strength, a reminder of her resilience and determination. Kate had survived the unthinkable and emerged stronger than ever. This was her life, her legacy, and no one would ever take it from her again.